You're listening to the Energy is Love podcast.
I have a relatively quick question for you. By the way,
just in awe with me right now.
I am in awe with you.
Okay, what's your question?
The people that are listening missed out on. We just recorded before we pushed record on this. We just recorded the intro for one of the recent episodes, and it was a ginormous shit show of.
We did our best.
Epic proportion. You're
gonna have a little bit of editing.
I'll have a lot of editing, and the majority of it was like start a sentence, and stop, and I don't know what to say next. That's funny when that happens.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, excuse me. It's because I was nervous.
Yeah.
But that's okay.
You said you had a question. You forgot your question.
I did.
Okay. It was like question for you real quick.
Yeah. Real quick question for you.
It was quick. It was so quick, I don't even know if it happened.
How are you?
That wasn't your question.
Are you doing good today?
I feel like I didn't come prepared with enough drinks.
Mm-hmm.
Types of drinks.
You've got 3 right now.
3 separate. Yes.
Types of drinks.
Mm-hmm. I'm missing some like hot cocoa or
Yeah.
chocolate milk.
So this episode, missing some hot cocoa.
I feel like that would balance it out.
Milk.
I've got water, beer, tea, and now I think chocolate milk might just bring it home.
You need some cacao.
So
That would be good.
that would actually be good.
When's the next full moon?
I think it's the 28th.
Of April?
Uh-huh.
Are you going to do a ceremony?
Well, I've been trying to do one since February, and it hasn't really been working out, so we'll see.
Maybe you should.
Maybe I should.
Yeah. That'd be fun.
It would be fun.
We'll see.
We'll see.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks for tuning in. We're done. And keep rolling, cut. No.
It'd be so funny if it shut off right there.
Oh my God, I'd be so pissed. So we have a couple of things that we're going to talk about today.
Are we?
And we'll just roll into it rather
Okay.
than sit and pretend like we don't know what we're going to talk about, because we actually have a plan this time. We came with a plan. We're a couple with a plan.
I was trying to think, how do we're a man and a woman
With
a
a plan. Hey man, do you have a plan?
Any binaries welcome. My tea is cold.
That's the name of the episode.
My tea is cold.
No, recently I came across, and I don't even know why it took me so long to find this, but it's probably because it doesn't interest me at all initially, right? But I came across this podcast. It's called the Mormon Stories podcast. And if you're here in the state of Utah, you're very familiar with Mormons to some extent, right? Some greater than, less than. If you're not familiar with the Mormon church in regards to like the world, go Google it. So if you've never heard of that religion before, I found out recently on the Mormon Stories podcast, because it was a big story locally in the news where they talked about how the church, meaning the LDS church, which is Latter-day Saints, they go by a bunch of different names. It's very confusing. Have $130 billion in the bank, which makes them the richest religion in the world. Did you know that?
I am actually surprised because, like, I figured the Catholics would still
Nope.
have it.
Mormons got them. $130 billion in the bank.
Damn.
And they can just leave that money there and make 7% interest essentially off of that investment, and will continue to accrue money regardless of whether or not they bring in any more. So they will just continue to grow financially and become a huge financial giant. They're in like the top potentially 100, the Fortune 500.
Not personally, but I've heard of it.
Anyways, getting sidetracked. Mormon Stories podcast. It's a great podcast if you're interested in anything in relation to the Mormon church. And the whole idea, I think, behind the podcast, the host of it, his name is John DeLynn, started it after and it's been around for like 10 or 12 years, which is like, I don't know how.
Is it really?
Oh yeah, it's old.
Holy cow.
Yeah, it's very old. It's been around for a long time.
I've only like this last year, recently,
Yeah.
the last few months, I feel like heard of it.
Well, same thing.
How is that possible?
It's because we're not super into the Mormon church at all,
So we,
right? So it's not like it was something that was on our radar.
mm-hmm.
But the idea behind the Mormon Stories podcast is not just Mormons, but also ex-Mormons and people that have left the church come on and share their story, right? Some people that he has on the show are still members of the church and some people aren't. So he has so many episodes, I mean, like 1,600 or something like that they're at now. And it's everybody's story about their experience with the church in one way, shape, or form. And he's got a bunch of other topics that they discuss and cover over the course of time and things like that. Like I said, it's been around forever and a day. But I've been binging it lately because I find it so incredibly fascinating, given, having been born and raised in this state.
Did you listen to the one with Natasha Helfer? Helfer? I think it's Helfer.
Helfer? Yeah, I did. I
you
listened to
listen
a
to
portion of it. Not all of it, but a portion of it. So we're going to talk. One of the things that I want to do on the podcast in the future is hopefully get some fucking Mormons to come on and talk about their, basically a modified version of the Mormon Stories podcast in some way, shape, or form, just because I find it such a fascinating topic. And I think that's a large part due to my experience with the church, my relationship with the religion.
Yeah.
So it's something that intrigues me. But rather than sit around and wait for somebody willing to come on the podcast and talk about whether or not they left the church or how their beliefs have changed over the years or whatever the case may be, I thought it would be fun if you and I told our Mormon stories.
Yeah.
Because you and I both have a history with the church and with the religion as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the things that we're going to talk about on the podcast. That's the majority of what we're going to talk about on the podcast today.
Okay.
But I do want to breathe. I'm not breathing.
Yeah.
Holding my breath. I'm very anxious.
Mm-hmm.
How are you?
I'm a little sleepy.
Steph's going to take a nap
I'm
this
gonna take
episode.
a nap. You're not going to breathe.
We'll get through it.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of gun violence in the country,
Mm-hmm.
in the United States lately. Not rare, right? Pretty regular. Seemed like we got a slight reprieve during 2020 and didn't have a lot of mass shootings. And
Starting back up.
So recently there's been quite a few mass shootings that have taken place throughout the country. And then, as usual, police are killing people on a really regular basis and murdering people. So all of those debates have started back up again, on top of the fact that they are, right in the midst of, keep in mind by the time this episode comes out, the trial may be done. I don't believe it will be, but they're right in the midst of the George Floyd trial as well. So there's just a lot that's going on in the country, and also a lot that is being talked about, as always, when police officers murder black people, when it's the same fucking story over and over and over and over and over again. And I thought about, we were going to do like a whole episode talking about all of this stuff again. And I don't want to right now. We might in the future. We might get into it down the road. There's a guy that I want to have come on Instagram and do one of our Insta Lives with us.
Who?
He's former LA police officer.
Okay.
He was a police officer in LA for his whole career. He retired, and now he's a Wim Hof instructor. And super cool guy. I don't remember his name. Eric. Gosh dang it, I don't remember his last name. I can only think of his username on Instagram, and it's totally not his last name. But he was on Robert Sturman's podcast way back in the day.
Yeah.
He's the cop that did that yoga pose. Do you remember?
Oh, yeah. I know who you're talking about.
Yeah. So we'll be talking about it in the future, of course. But like, I was going to break down the latest, or one of the latest cases with the woman the police officer that shot. And I don't know his name. I don't remember his name. You can look it up, babe. But shot this kid. I mean, he was 19, 21 years old or something like that. Instead of tasing him, she thought that she was using her taser, and instead shot him, and he died.
Dante, right?
Yeah. And I was going to talk a lot about that.
He was 20.
He was 20. Because I watched the body cam footage. It's clear as day that she thought she was tasing him, and instead she shot him. I don't need to go into details about it. It's so sad, and it's so infuriating. And the arguments that are being had right now, like, this is my stance, and then we'll just kind of move on. Unless, of course, you want to share yours as well. Law enforcement is drastically, severely broken. Law enforcement as a whole, meaning the, what's the right word? The entity of, the culture of, the, what is the right word, babe? Help me out.
I'm at a loss. Society.
Law enforcement.
Their whole infrastructure.
Yeah, like
That's
just,
not what you want.
I don't know what the right word is. Just
Well,
law
let's move
enforcement as a whole is broken. And from a very foundational level, it needs to be changed. And not just in small ways of changing up officers' tactics and training and how they approach situations and giving them better conflict resolution skills. And yes, all of those things are massively important. But it needs a complete overhaul from the ground up, because the arguments are still the same on each side, right? It's like a portion of society is saying, hey, how about you guys just stop fucking killing people, including the majority of which are black people. And law enforcement said, hey, how about you guys just start up following our rules and doing what we tell you to? Yeah. And that's not fixing anything. It's not solving anything. We're still killing people. And by we, I mean police officers that don't need to die. So that's that, right? I don't think it's too hard of a situation. It's too hard of a problem to try to discuss in 14 seconds. And then gun violence and mass shootings. I don't think guns are the problem. I think it is strictly a mental health issue. And I think that until we start really shifting and changing the way that we deal with mental health and looking at mental health in this country and dealing with it and addressing it and meeting it like head on, we're going to continue to have these problems with mass shootings. And yes, there does need to be new legislation about guns and gun rights and all this kind of stuff, but guns are not the problem. It's mental health. People that choose to go into a crowded area and murder a bunch of people are mentally ill and broken and need help. And they needed that help, not at that moment, obviously, but, long before that moment in time. And to think that somehow we're going to solve that problem with getting rid of guns or restricting guns more or, militarizing our police more. I mean, there's not a solution I see, with the exception of fucking get real serious about mental health and go from there. I'm just rambling, babe.
You've started 3 different conversations.
Yes.
Well, I've just waited. So I'm like, where do I start?
That's all the shit that I wanted to talk about on the podcast. And
You
I'm
did.
like, I don't want to talk about it on the podcast.
Okay.
But yet at the same time, I'm like, fuck, I'm just so fed up with it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I'm so fed up with it.
Uh-huh.
It's ridiculous at this point. I have a bunch of friends that are still police officers, and I sit and watch them post the most fucking asinine, retarded shit on social media. Mm-hmm. And their arguments are narrow-minded and ignorant.
Systemic.
Yes, very systemic, of not just the issues with law enforcement, but white supremacy, misogyny. The list just goes on and on and on why they think the way that they think.
It's a conditioning too.
Yeah.
There is a, yeah.
Keep going.
Are you sure?
Please, I'm trying to shut up and stop fucking talking so that you can talk for a minute.
I don't know where to start. Like I said, there's 3 things that you went over, and I'm like, I want to talk this about this one. Oh, I want to talk about this with this, and I want to talk about this here. So you reverted back to the second one. I think there is a lot of conditioning and a lot of, it's that like hidden racism that is only hidden to white people, basically.
Hidden to the racists.
Mm-hmm. They think that, this is the way it's brought up, and they have their whole dynamics of how pictures are painted, which is completely false. And then the training they get, which reiterates those. So how do you, because it's like, it's a training thing, but there's also these cultural bias that are so ingrained. Like, how is it not known? How are they not breaking these when they hand you a badge and a gun and changing everything? How is it still like they're repeating the same bad patterns and repeating everything? So when you're having these people that you're close with still posting these things, I don't know, maybe it's just being hopeful, but I like to think that there's a possibility that, because you've seen it happen. It's happened with us. We have light bulbs that we allow to go off and be like, this is not right. It's time to do it different. It's time to think differently. And just, as we said, being willing to be curious and being willing to be wrong. So when it's such a...
I think the wrong part is the first one that needs to happen. Like the ability to even entertain the idea that you're wrong. Mm-hmm. That you're just wrong. And that's really, really hard for police officers to even entertain that idea.
They're still not doing it when people are getting murdered.
Right?
They're still not wrong. It's like, how can that not...
Yeah.
Like, it's got to be, like, there's something inside of you that hears that. There's no way. So why... something Trevor Noah was saying, and about...
Our good friend Trevor.
Yeah.
The other night when we were hanging out with Trevor, we just call him TN for short, Trevor Noah.
He was talking about people are posting like, where are the good apples?
Yeah.
And he went on to that because they're saying it's just bad apples. It's not the whole force. It's not all of this. There's bad apples. And then he clarified saying he doesn't believe that he's not saying all police are bad, all bad apples. But what he's talking about is like, where are the good apples? Where are the ones that are stopping the murders that are happening? Where are the ones? Because these officers, I think that one with that 13-year-old boy was by himself, but most of them have other people there. With George Floyd, there was other people there. With Dante, there was other people there. So when you have this one that's out of hand doing this, why are they not speaking up in that situation? Why are they just kind of standing back and going with it, not knowing what to do? And then he was talking about that's how, like, that's the change that needs to be made. But that's how, I don't know what his words were. Oh, I don't want to mess this up. I'll just have to create my own because I can't quote him.
I don't think TN will mind.
That's how deep the problem is in how institutionalized it is, that they are too afraid to go up against the system because they know that that's going to take them out, that it is so powerful and in such control with such violence that even to speak out against that is going to take them out. So they're too afraid to even be able to do the right things because of how wrong it is. And then he said the system isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. We need to change the system.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's not broken, right? It's by its nature and structure, it is doing exactly what it's supposed to do.
That's really
prey on poor people. And who's poor in this country? Minorities, black people, people of color.
Did you watch the same one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. What do you mean watch the same one?
We didn't watch it together.
You mean The Daily Show with Trevor Noah? No, he was hanging out and we had this conversation.
Yeah, that's right.
Don't you remember the other night?
Has he even left his apartment or penthouse, whatever?
We were at his apartment. We flew to New York to hang out.
He let us in through the plexiglass.
I wanted to go through and talk about that female officer and her career in law enforcement, and how can somebody who has how can somebody who can have a 20 plus year career in law enforcement be a field training officer, meaning she's teaching new officers, be in all of these different supervisory roles throughout her career, how can she still make the mistake of pulling her gun instead of her taser? And it's clear as day to me why she can still make that mistake.
Why?
Well, there's an endless list of reasons why she still makes that mistake, right? Training isn't a thing. They're not trained properly. The level of stress that police officers are under and how that affects them and how disassociated they get from experiences and from interactions to the point where they're kind of checked out. So it makes perfect sense to me that she's been an officer for 26 years, I think it is. And they're making a routine traffic stop and a routine arrest. And she's not really present and not really there. And then immediately is in a heightened state. And if you don't train, and who's to say, well, of course she's going to have experience in training. Probably not. Like, that's the sad truth, is probably not. The level of training that police officers undergo, we all know, is super lacking. There's just a lot of different reasons why that thing can happen.
Yeah.
And we hate to think that, that's something that a brand new officer does. Well, it's far more likely that a veteran officer is going to make a mistake like that than a brand new officer because of all the other issues at play.
The trauma that she's probably got going through her body from all the stuff that she's seen, from all the stuff that she's inflicted.
Yeah. And
experienced.
I was going to go off on all of this stuff and I'm exhausted.
Not going to. Okay.
I don't want to. It just sucks and it's frustrating. And it's not a matter of like, oh, we need to... The idea that law enforcement doesn't need to change and that it's just society that needs to change is so stupid. And that argument I don't think can be made anymore. And if you're making that argument still, then you really, really, really are an idiot. And then like the idea that guns are the problem, they're not. And just like I said, from the very, very foundation of law enforcement, it needs to change. Everything needs to be, and it's not even law enforcement, it's criminal justice system as a whole, right?
Yeah.
Courts, everything. We need to take everything back to the very beginning and rebuild it.
Or police were created just to capture slaves.
Right.
That is the only reason we have that.
So all of it needs to be changed. Otherwise, it's going to continue to happen exactly like the way that it's happening, right? Go ahead.
It's what it's shown.
Mm-hmm.
You don't think guns the problem at all? Like, I agree with you. It's definitely a mental health. I think it's mental health. And
like when it comes to the mass shooting stuff?
Yes, but I guess you can use it
also
however.
Police shootings, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think guns are a problem. It's not a matter of saying that they're not, right?
No.
This problem is not just one thing or one solution or one fix. But the way that everything gets polarized in the media and the way that it only becomes one or the other. It's either gun rights it's either a gun issue or it's not, right? We're going to take your guns away, or fuck you, you're never going to take my gun away. The whole argument about guns is pointless.
What about the type of weapons?
It's still a gun.
It's still a gun, but I think that there can be... I differ on this opinion with you on that. I think that I absolutely believe that mental health is an issue, but I think that guns are an issue. And I'm not saying that guns need to be taken away, but I do think it's ridiculous to have military type weapons in your next door neighbor's house, in your house, in whoever's house on the block. Like, those kind of weapons that are designed for mass damage, mass killings, shouldn't be just something you got hanging out in your living room. Like, I think that a lot needs to be changed with guns.
Yeah.
But I can't see a reason to have an assault rifle just for fun. Like, it's just like, oh, that's a killing machine. It is designed to kill rapidly. There was a post that I saw that upset me. It was showing somebody's protesting sign against an AR-15, and it showed this massive hole, and it was like, this is the size of the bullet hole that this makes. Why does anybody need this? Mm-hmm. And the argument and like the counter to that from the guns rights activists showed a smaller hole and said, this is false. This is the actual size of the hole. Get your information right. Like a smaller hole. It's a hole in a body.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
why is that
We're
better?
arguing.
It's a smaller hole. It's a hole in a body. It's a hole in a child. It's a hole. Like, no, that's not an argument. The hole's not that big.
Yeah. I agree with everything that you're saying. The part that infuriates me is the idea that we are wasting time on this gun issue when I feel like it's probably the fourth or the fifth or the sixth thing down the line that we should actually address. The bigger issue is mental health. The bigger issue is, how on earth can a person go into some place and kill somebody? And how on earth is this something that continually happens in this country?
I agree.
Right? Let's set the whole gun argument aside for a minute. We're not taking any guns away. The Second Amendment is staying intact. We're not going to argue about what legislation needs to happen. We're just going to set that fucking down for now. Mm-hmm. And let's address the real issue, right? Let's go to some heart of actually what is going on. They always talk about trying to figure out the motive and how can these people do, usually men, right? Usually white men, how can they do these terrible, terrible things? Let's figure out that.
I agree.
Has nothing to do with access to a gun or an AR or...
I think the access definitely helps, but I believe mental illness is the first priority.
Yeah. And as always, it's not what they're talking about.
Yeah.
It's not what's being shown. It's not what's being covered. It's not what's being discussed, right? They're not enacting laws or putting forth legislation to do dick about mental health in this country.
It's illegal to be mentally ill.
Illegal?
Illegal. Hear me out.
Okay.
So you have somebody and it's like, please get help. Please get help. If you're experiencing this, please get help. But what happens if they go get help? Right?
Yeah.
Or if they show signs, they're arrested. They're put in jail for it. They're shunned. They're like labeled this like crazy, chaotic villain. So they're like, oh, get help. There's help out there. But we're going to just tear you to shreds for it. So it needs to, mental health can stop being illegal, even though it's not technically, but you are punished criminally for having mental issues, including just talking to somebody else. You scare other people if you're talking to somebody that they can't see. So there's so many different things with that I think.
Yeah.
But I just got nervous and lost my train of thought.
Okay. It's something that we could sit and go back and forth about. And I really want to try to bring somebody else on that we can have a conversation with about as well. Not necessarily opposing point of views, because I'm not looking to fucking argue with people that are so staunchly in that space that police can do no wrong and the criminals need to change. And, you know, if they wouldn't resist and if they would just follow orders. And like the one guy, the army officer or the lieutenant in the military who is driving, is getting pulled over and proceeds to drive like slowly with his blinkers or his flashers on so that he can get to a well-lit area because he's a person of color and he knows that in uniform, and he knows that it's dangerous to be pulled over by police and he wants to make the situation as safe as possible. And then he eventually gets, I mean, he's, you know, that's another story that's just come up. And
he lived, he got pepper sprayed.
Yeah, pepper sprayed.
But it was incredibly.
Yeah. And the argument that that's the officer's fault, right? What I mean is that, like, because the argument in law enforcement is, first off, he should have pulled over immediately, right? He should have complied with all commands, right? And he didn't comply with commands. That's the argument in law enforcement. If he would have complied, then he would have been fine and nothing would have happened, right? And then also if they just slightly skew their point of view a little bit, then everything becomes that individual officer and his actions and what he did. Granted, his actions were terrible.
Very.
Right? He was fired, rightfully so. He should not be a police officer. He's a fucking asshole. But that isn't, once again, it's not those two polarities, right? The issue underlying that entire situation is law enforcement is broken.
Yes.
Not that officer is doing something wrong or bad, or that he stepped outside of the bounds of, he didn't do anything. I shouldn't say he didn't do anything wrong. He did a lot of things that were wrong.
Outside of what he's been trained to do. Is that what you mean?
What the norm is and how you handle those situations as a police officer, and what is quote unquote justified as a police officer. He was right in line.
And that's a problem.
That's a problem. Yeah, massively. Massively, massively. Anyways, let's shift gears. Because it feels like a fucking overwhelming fucking
It is overwhelming.
topic, right? And
it is overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
It's overwhelming and it's ongoing. It's not stopping.
Mostly it's, for me, I just want to highlight it's mental health.
Okay.
Right? That's the issue. It's mental health. So if you're listening and you think it's another issue, write us in, let us know. Feel free to engage and argue with us online.
Feel free to have an open conversation.
Feel free to have an open conversation. It's a much better way to say it. But just fucking take a look at the idea that maybe it is a mental health issue. Maybe people really need help and society is not helping them at all. So should we change gears, babe?
Sure.
We'll just go all over the...
Do you want to go back to your first topic?
Yeah. Let's go back to the Mormon Church, Mormon Stories podcast.
Okay.
Right? That's a super smooth transition.
Right.
Seems like these two things definitely go within the same context of the same episode.
Money, power, and control.
In some ways they do, right? Because there's people that have a sense of...
benefiting the white man.
But somebody that's indoctrinated into the church and into the religion. From now on, we're just going to, unless we reference a different religion, we're just going to be talking about the Mormon Church to make it simple. But you're indoctrinated into this system, taught that everything is this way, just like law enforcement, right? Mm-hmm. And then eventually you see things differently, and it shifts and changes your entire perspective, your identity, and who you are as a person. So it's a very big thing when somebody leaves the church.
Or gets removed.
Or gets removed, gets excommunicated, right?
For
just having
different beliefs. For thinking that masturbation is not a sin. For being gay or supporting rights. For thinking that sex can be healthy and normal as opposed to a sin.
Yeah.
Abusing. Okay. I was about to
keep going.
I want to make sure that I am speaking through thought, and I want to be active instead of reactive, because that's one of the things that in a classic abusive situation that they do is when things come up and then you're reactive, then it discredits you because you're being emotional, you're unhinged, all of these things that show that you were wrong and they are right. So I want to be careful I feel that coming on. And I think everybody has the right to be reactive to this because it's also painful. But I don't want to be reactive right now. I want to be active so I have a better chance of being heard and other people have a better chance of being heard.
Well, tell your Mormon story.
That's not where I was going to go.
Where were you going to go?
I know that's where you want to go. I want to talk about the Mormon sex therapist that is on trial now by her previous, I don't even remember what it's called. She's from Kansas. That happens to be her soon-to-be ex-husband's former boss. That all of these years have passed. She's wrote blogs about how masturbation is not sinful. That if you watch porn, it does not mean that you are now a sex addict because you watched some porn. And that she is for homosexual marriage. that this is past. It's been 10 years, but now that she's going through a divorce, suddenly he has a problem with it. And now she's going on trial. They're looking at removing her from the church, excommunicating her because of her beliefs. She has been a therapist and helping many Mormons and non-Mormons who go in, and she is teaching them. She's not saying whether or not they should leave the church or not, but she is just giving them fact-based evidence on sexual health. And it happens to not align with the control of the Mormon church. I'm not going to go through and be like Latter-day Saints. Like, I understand.
You can call it whatever you want.
I'm going to call it whatever I want.
Yeah.
Because it's just all. But she's not leading people one way or the other. She was just like, here's this fact-based evidence. It is my ethical responsibilities to give you that, not some church curtain. And now she's looking at being removed from the church. Yeah. Because she's being honest. She's being honest, and she's not perpetuating. What's the fucking word?
Perpetuating.
Thank you. I don't know what kind of thank you that was. The shame and control that they have over people and how hard it is. And now she is going to be on trial to see if she's still worthy enough to be in the religion.
It's asinine.
That's incredibly
This is a
crazy.
recent episode of the Mormon Stories podcast. So
I haven't heard it. I just saw the article. It's in the Washington Post.
Is it in the Washington Post?
The Washington Post.
It's episode 1420. Her name's Natasha Helfer. You can go find it. The Mormon Stories podcast you can find everywhere. Same thing like any podcast. Wherever you're listening to this podcast, just search it out and you'll find it. But it's a recent episode.
I'm going to go listen to that one.
Yeah.
Because I want to hear her.
I've listened to the first part of it so far.
Yeah.
Yeah. Haven't gotten in super deep into it yet, but I mean, it's not surprising, super common.
I know it's super common, but I'm glad that there's a lot of noise coming from it.
Yeah.
I'm glad that it's getting this publicity because her message is getting out there. Yeah, the control of the church is still showing through, and it is threatening others who might speak up that you can be at risk of being removed. But I feel like her message there is going to be louder than theirs, because she's like, there is nothing wrong with this. There's nothing wrong with you as a person. There's nothing wrong with you. And there is another way to look at things. And so more people, I think, are going to hear that as opposed to the threats and the control and the weight that the church puts on people to conform and to lie.
Yeah. It's one example of many examples of how broken I believe the church is and how damaging it is to people's lives. Like, just kind of across the board. And unfortunately, like I said, it's one of many examples. Right? Give everybody just the briefest of your experience with the church.
I get brief? Okay.
Let
me summarize mine.
You don't have to
because I'm a woman and I need to keep it brief.
You definitely don't have to keep it brief. You get to be as long as you want, obviously.
It's okay. Let's see. So my mom was born into it very deep. My grandparents were born into it. Great grandma sealed in the temple. My grandma sealed in the temple. My grandpa is the one that baptized me. I was baptized because, first of all, that's what you do. And then your family makes a big deal about it. Like, here it comes. You're 8 years old. Here's this big thing. My mom, she was outcasted for her sinly behaviors, and she did not agree with the church. However, she held on to more of the beliefs than she realized she did. She still was very much in line with, she was more accepting, but she was still very much, it still had a hold on her, and it still had a hold on me. There were parts where, because I grew up in such a small town in Utah, and even though it was a military base, you would expect there was some other religions that came through, but not really. Like, you had different followings, but it was still the Mormons that like controlled everything. It was it seemed like I didn't really get a fluctuation. It was weird, not weird, but kind of, I guess it was rare when somebody went to the Catholic church that was there, because that was just such not a thing. And I think they had 3 different religions that held in that church. But oddly enough, that church was allowed to be on the base, but the Mormon church wasn't. So that had to be built just directly off base. And everybody went there. I remember all the friends that stayed, that wasn't in and out with the military, was there in order to, the part of the military base was, it was also civilian life as well. So you did have the fluctuating people moving in and out, but you also had your standard. There have people that I know that lived there as civilians, or, my entire life. It was very much led by that. You had good Mormon girl is such a thing. That is such an ingrained thing that you got to hang out. There was the groups. There was the good girls, and there was the bad girls. And when I was little, I remember I tried to fit in. I wanted to go to church. I tried to fit in. And my mom, I cannot blame her, did not want to go and did not take me. And I'm grateful. But I still wanted to fit in, and it was still, I'm supposed to make this short.
Don't. You're
Dad.
fine. You don't have to make anything short.
I didn't fit in, and it became more apparent. I tried, and there was all these groups and things that would happen within the church. And if you were in the church, you got included in these playthings, but I wasn't. And that seemed to just really fit in the school. It was the church groups. Everybody kind of stuck together. And if you did things that were outside of the behaviors that were acceptable, meaning like if you swore, like, there was so much shame for that. And I held that too. Like a long time, we didn't let our kids, there's so much to go with that. I feel like there's going to be a lot of unpacking here. So I will definitely try to. I wish I could say more.
You can.
I really, there's so much. I want to hear yours. It was still held very deep, and I knew that I wasn't welcome. And they would, for a while, when they would come collect the tithings. I remember these blue envelopes that they would have, and they would send people around, and that still happened when I was an adult in Tula. Nobody's shown up here with a blue envelope as far as I know. So we haven't, but they would send their kids. So the little kids come to the door. So as adults, I remember my mom, when you have these kids coming to the door to collect the money. So that's how the church gets it.
Yeah. And
so you're not going to say no to your, 6-year-old neighbor's kid who's coming up with her little blue envelope, I wanted to belong because I wanted to belong to something, but it never felt right for me. So I would try and belong, and I would be there, and I wouldn't, and I would do things differently. I remember I had a friend invite me to Mutual, and that's the thing that they do out here. It was on Wednesdays, and it's just to get women in line. It's young women's, and they also do it for young men's. And so that's how they start prepping them. Are you going to hold the priesthood, or are you going to be the one that bakes casseroles? This is your list. Are you going to take care of the kids and support the men, or are you going to be the ones that get to hold power over everybody? You have to be worthy to hold the power. And if you're worthy, then you get to control everything, and everybody caters to you. And if you're worthy enough, then you get to serve, and you get to bring the casseroles, and you need to keep the kids in line and report to your husband and be a good wife. So I went, I tried, and it was very much I've said this before, but it stuck so hard because.
What are some of the things that you feel like you have?
I'm rambling.
That stuck.
What are you doing here? What are you doing here? And that can be when you see what are you doing here? But it was so much everywhere I went. What are you doing here? What are you doing here? And finally it was I'm leaving. So I started hitchhiking home from, it's only 10 miles, but it was a long straight road.
From church.
Mm-hmm. That was the last time I tried. Not being good. I'm not going to be able to get into this. This is too deep to give a short story. Not being good enough, not fitting in, not going to go to heaven, deserving pain, deserving like whatever bad things happen. It's your punishment because you haven't been following the gospel. The Book of Mormon writing over the Bible. I no longer hold the Bible with anything, but I used to. And I could not understand why everything else was false. Anything that was written against the Bible was anti, except for the Book of Mormon. It never felt right, but I really wanted it to feel right.
Was it just that drive, you think, just so that you could fit in?
So I could fit in, so I could go to heaven, so I could be with my family forever, so I could make my grandparents proud, so I could make my parents proud. I mean, I thought it was one of the biggest honors that it was my grandpa that baptized me. I mean, and for a long time, like I remember when I was younger, I thought I want to be removed from the church. I want to like excommunicate myself, but I couldn't. I could not. That hold was so strong. I'm like, I don't want to lose that piece of my grandpa. He's the one. So that's our connection. And if I let this go, then I'm letting him go. And then I'm not going to see him when I die. I'm not going to see him. Having my grandparents, my Nana and my mom talk to me about getting the kids blessed and getting them like in the church, because God doesn't see kids that aren't blessed.
Right.
But that fucking hit me, because then I was like, it messed me up inside. I was sitting here hating. I'm like, this doesn't feel right. And then I finally gave to like, you can give them a blessing, but they can't be blessed. I didn't want them to be stuck in a situation. I always wanted them to be able to make their own decision. But then I was sitting here like pondering this, like, what if something happens? Is God not going to see my kids? Like it hits. So I realize how crazy that sounds, but it's not going to sound crazy to a lot of people that are probably being like, yeah, God doesn't see your kids. I'm not even going to touch that. Right. There's too much to unpack there, but it dictated so much on, my mom caught me masturbating as a kid and told me Jesus wouldn't like that. Like masturbation was wrong. Premarital sex was wrong. Impure thoughts was wrong. Wearing clothes that was like promiscuous. And by the way, like promiscuous was if you could see an inch above your kneecap, your shoulders are out, your cleat, like being any of that, you are asking for attention. You are asking for it. And you are like anything bad that I know that ties into rape culture, but it does. They're very much on that. It impacted me so hard, and in ways it still kind of does. And then I would see it changed as a parent when I was also in a very, like everywhere's a Mormon neighborhood in Utah. My street was very, very active when the kids were growing up. They were very, very active. And my kids it changed. They were good enough to play with, except for on Sundays. They weren't allowed to play on Sundays. And that's because it's a church thing. However, there was always get-togethers where all the church kids could play on Sundays. But my kids would be sent away and they would have their feelings hurt. That made me a little crazy. I love that. I was like, I'm gonna burn some shit down here. And then it kind of started to fade to where now it wasn't just on Sundays, but my kids couldn't be played with a lot. I would have Relief Society come over. I had a woman shame me very hard. She was like, this is what's going on at the church. You can bring your kids. And we're doing this thing if you ever decide that you're going to go or take your kids. And it was just like, she said it with such attitude. It wasn't just one of those passing. She ended up breaking free of the church and her husband. And like, she just left it all. And then we saw each other one time at the store and she had nothing but shame in her eyes. And it made me so sad. And it was like, she lost all her worth. She had all of her worth tied into that.
Yeah, all that identity, huh?
And I still have people that I care about right now in my life deeply. I have people that are questioning the church, and there's so much that I want to share with them, but I don't want to Because this is just a tiny little scratch of the surface. This is my short version. I don't want to pull them because they've got to find their journey. This is a hard thing when they have been in the church forever. And when it feels like that is home, but things are off, I'm here. It's like, I understand to a point. I didn't grow up into it like the levels that they did, but look at the holds that it has on me. And I was distant. I was so distant. So I feel bad when they're doubting themselves as a human, when they are doubting themselves as a woman, when they feel like they're failing everything because they're starting to see things that don't add up. And so I can just be supportive. And then I have others that are very much like they are still, I know this church is true in there. And things will upset them and they feel they're less than for not being able to uphold all of these standards, but they don't even see it as a church thing. They're just like, I'm failing because of this and this and this. And to find that way to navigate, luckily you just have to listen. I can just hear, but I'm seeing the way it is tormenting so many people in so many different ways. And they don't even see it at that point. They can't even see it because it's their failures is the only thing that they see. There's my brief. What's your brief Mormon story? You got 20 minutes to be brief.
It'll probably be something that we continue to talk about on the podcast for a while. One of the things, listening to this Mormon Stories podcast and starting to think about originally my story would have been born and raised in the church in the sense that, like, my mom was born in the same small town that we live in now. She was born and raised into an LDS family. Her mom was a convert, if I remember correctly. My grandpa went on a mission, and then he met my grandma at like a mission reunion party thing, and she just happened to be there. I don't know the whole story. Anyways, my grandmother was a convert to the church. And anyways, it is too big to try to dissect in one little tiny episode. But that originally would have been my story. Was my mom was LDS, my dad was Catholic. They met, they got married, started to raise us, and because we grew up in this small town where everybody was Mormon, we were as well. And we went to Mormon church. We never went to Catholic church. My dad would come to Mormon church with us. He would come to church with us. And originally the idea in my mind was we went there because that's just what you did. And it was being part of the community. And we were heavily involved in scouting, Boy Scouts and Cub Scouts. And that was also ingrained. They were one and the same, essentially, right? The church and scouting essentially interacted in the same. You didn't have one without the other. They were the same. So that's why we went to church. We weren't practicing outside of church. We basically put on dress clothes on Sundays, went to church, came home and took them off, and that was it. And originally that was my story in my mind, and that's kind of what I had carried for a really long time, was that it wasn't that big of a deal. I grew up in this town. Everybody that I grew up with was Mormon, and all my friends, all those social circles that I hung out with. We stopped going to church when I was probably 9 or 10 years old. I was baptized by my grandpa as well. I remember trying to really believe the church, believe the teachings and the doctrine of the church when I was 14, going into high school, and went to seminary. Seminary is like, I don't know how you would describe it. It's like here in Utah, in a lot of places here in Utah, they just incorporate it into school. So it's a period that you would basically go, and it's church teachings. So it's like Mormon school for a period. But I went to seminary for like a semester and tried really hard I wanted to believe, because I I think I was looking for that avenue of fitting in even more so. A lot of the things that were happening in my life during that time period were leaving me, like that was the same time period that my parents got divorced, and like my oldest brother had moved out and gone to college. Brian was, like a senior or something like that, junior or senior in high school. So I was really looking for a place to fit and hoping that that was going to be it. And it wasn't. But then it basically didn't really play a role in my life outside of that. That would have been my story.
Okay.
And that was my story for a really long time. And I really just looked past everything. I didn't really care about the church. I didn't care about what, I just accepted the fact that it was a thing here in Utah.
Mm-hmm.
And because I've lived here in Utah my whole life, essentially, it's just kind of the way it is. There's not a lot you can do about it, right? Just kind of the way that it is.
Uh-huh.
It's heavily incorporated into our politics, into our government. Essentially, every aspect of life in one way, shape, or form is influenced by the church here in this state.
Mm-hmm.
But that necessarily wasn't an issue for me. That didn't bother me. That wasn't something that I felt like I just didn't care and didn't really look at it. And then recently, in listening to this Mormon Stories podcast and hearing some of these stories and really just starting to go back and look at how much of an impact the religion had on my entire life in so many different regards, right? Not the defining characteristics of things and not the defining factors, but such a heavy influence on so many different things. And you and I've talked about this a little bit, but the list is endless. All of the shame because of actions and behaviors. And I think we used to joke in my family that we were just like poor white trash from Center Street. And we weren't poor, but we were low income, right? Kind of, but at the same time, like, what I'm getting at is I think we used to joke about it as a family, but I think because there was a part of it too that I never felt like our family was accepted by the community, and I never felt accepted by all of those groups, and I always felt like an outsider. But yet everything that we did had some connection to the church in some way, shape, or form, even if it wasn't a church activity in a sense. First and foremost, like I said, scouting was a very big part of my upbringing in my family because we were heavily involved in it. And all of that was church-related stuff. So at the church, for scout meetings, pack meetings, ceremonies, all that kind of stuff, all of that stuff took place at the church. Everybody else that was in scouting with us was Mormon and was part of the church. But I think that it feels like they never accepted our family, and our family was always kind of like the black sheep in a sense. And that I carried that in regards to my friendships with all of these other kids my age who were the same thing, heavily involved in the church, all LDS, and never feeling like I really belonged and that I was always judged, and having to just kind of accept that and still move on because I wanted to still be friends with these people. And like that dynamic of even my closest friends, even like my best friends growing up, all of them were Mormon. And I felt like all of them, meaning like their families and their parents, and in some way, shape, or form, them as individuals as well, judged me for not being. So there was always some level of judgment that existed because I was not. And so I had to figure out a way to internalize that without letting it affect me so that I can continue to have friends and hang out with these guys that I was hanging out with. And that was like my entire life. That was from like as early as you start hanging out with friends at school all the way up until you graduate from high school. And it's all the same group of people because it's the small town. So there was never any, like I can sit here as I'm bringing this up and talking about just this dynamic. I can think about time and 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 time again, where I have all of these moments of recognition of when I felt that judgment, right? When I went into a situation and there was a part of myself that would forget about it and wouldn't look at it and wouldn't worry about it. Like if it was me and my buddies out riding bikes around town and messing around, for the most part, it wasn't there, right? Every now and then it would pop up, but it wasn't a big deal. But then like going back to their houses or a birthday party or, do you know what I mean? Some event or scouting thing, then suddenly it's all there. And they fall in line with the norm. And then I get it from them as well. So I get it from my closest friends, from the people that I love and care about and that I'm spending all of my time with as a kid. Still getting that judgment. And that's, you know, I mean, there's only one way that it feels. It feels like you're being looked down upon. Like it feels like, and I know that they would articulate it differently. I know that they all have different justifications. And I know the church as a whole has a, you know, like their whole idea that they're just trying to provide this beautiful religion to the world and they want everybody to come into the fold because it's, you know, you
want everybody to make it to the celestial kingdom.
Yeah. Like I know that they have a way of justifying it, but the way it manifests in action and behavior, if you're on the outside of it, is fucking judgment. And it makes you feel like shit. And I had to internalize all of that so that I could still kind of exist in the same social groups that I was in. And the alternative, and once I got into high school, I discovered the alternative because I started to spend time with kids who weren't LDS, because all of my buddies, you know, we grew up a little bit, and in high school they started to separate and spend time with other people. And then it was suddenly like I needed somebody to hang out with. And I started hanging out with the bad kids or the bad crowd, even though they weren't totally fucking normal kids. And that was an interesting thing to not have that judgment present in those experiences. And then the other thing that, I mean, not the other thing, the endless list of things that we could talk about, but how I would also carry that judgment and inflict it on other people, where I would judge people who weren't Mormon. Keep in mind, not active, right? We're not going to church, not fucking Mormon. But yet I would look down on people and judge them because they weren't abiding by that same moral standard that the church upholds and that their members follow. So that's just, I mean, that alone, that simple dynamic of we weren't active, we weren't part of the church, we stopped going to church, we never really were religious, and then being heavily ingrained into the culture and into the society, and always feeling that always carrying that weight of being judged and being looked down upon. That alone, I believe, obviously, not a big shocker, has massive impact and influenced me massively. And I've only just now started to look at that.
Yeah.
Only just now started to kind of pick that apart and figure that out.
Not too long ago, you said something during a podcast where you weren't really affected by it. And I was just like...
I remember when when you and I moved in together and we moved to this town, and you had such an issue with the way the kids would be treated. And I remember Gwen and Maddie going to school and complaining about things. And I remember thinking, yeah, that sucks, but it's fine. Just deal with it. And not in like a mean way, just in a because I had just come to terms with all of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, it's not that big of a deal. Yes, they're going to behave that way. You know, it's not as bad as you think it is. They're really good people. And they are, right?
Mm-hmm.
They are. It's not to say that Mormons are evil. It's not to say that the
No.
people in this community, you know, my friends, their parents, you know, I still go down to fucking the grocery store in this town and see people that knew me from when I was a kid, see adults that knew me from when they're good people. But the culture and the mentality and the teachings and the way that it manifests, that is fucking terrible and so toxic and so detrimental. And they don't see it. And that's just one tiny aspect of what that culture is. And by that culture, I mean the Mormon church, the culture and the teachings, and that culture itself has so many toxic things about it. And that's just one that I don't feel like would ever really see or have a grasp of, right? Could never really conceptually understand. And instead it's just in their minds probably processed a lot as far as like sympathy and pity and a nice thing that we're doing, allowing Craig to still be in our home, and we're going to have, you know, yes, he can eat dinner with us, and we're going to say the prayer, and we're going to try to incorporate, you know, we're going to invite him to come to these church events, and because we're being nice and we've got sympathy for him. It doesn't feel like that when you're on the receiving end of it.
No.
It feels quite a bit different. So there's lots of different ways that I believe the church has influenced and affected my life, affected our life, our children's lives. And there's more, right? Like you said, this is a big topic that we could unpick and unpack for quite a while.
There's a conversation that keeps happening between Asher and I right now of how it's affecting him. Is he has some friends that aren't Mormon, and he has some friends that he cares a lot about that are Mormon.
Yeah.
And he is like with their, like, if I know their parents, he's like, please don't tell them this about me. Like, he's asking me, he has to ask his mom, and to think this isn't going to have some effect from him in the future, to please not be herself, to please not show these sides of her to them because they're Mormon. And then he won't be able to hang out with his friend anymore because the parents will no longer, they will judge him because of who I am and not let him hang out.
Yeah.
And like, he has to say that to me. And you know, there's this part where I want to teach him to be him, and like, you don't have to hide who you are for anybody, but I know how painful that is. So it's like, of course, but there's always the chance, like, they're going to listen to this podcast and they're going to hear that, and then he's going to lose somebody that he cares deeply about because we don't fit that mold. And you can kind of not fit that mold safely.
Yeah.
Like, you can be that to where you are, like you said, the pity, the project, where they're going to like you anyways. You still get to hang out but then there comes that point where if you just don't fall in line enough, then you are toxic. You're not allowed around them. You're not there. The church has so many stipulations, like we mentioned earlier, on like God forbid they find out I masturbate. You know? Like, that's the easiest of my sins.
Sometimes we masturbate while we're drinking alcohol at the same time.
It's a mutual masturbation
with all the beer.
So it is still painful, and it is still causing pain. And there's still things that we are participating in because that's the culture.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And, you know, we still live in this town.
We still live in this town.
We still live in this town that I grew up in that is 100% predominantly LDS. And there's a church, you know, within, you can stand in front of one church and throw a rock and hit another church.
There's so many churches in this town.
Yeah.
So many.
And it's a small town.
It's a small town. We got one stoplight here.
We do only have one stoplight. We need a couple more, but we only have one.
Can you imagine if we had as many stoplights as we did Mormon churches in this town?
Couldn't get anywhere. We'd have one in front of our driveway to get out of our house. I think we'll talk more about this. I think it's going to be an ongoing thing. Like I said, I've been binging Mormon Stories podcast. I can't recommend it enough. Hopefully we can find some people to come on and share their story a little bit and talk about, regardless of whether or not you were born and raised in the church, or I've got a couple of people that I would love to come and share their story because they've left the church. And so if you're listening to this and you've left the church because of one reason or another, right? There's a long list of why I think people leave the church or potentially leave the church. But if you have, please reach out, because we'd love to chat with you and have you on the podcast. And I just find it really, really fascinating. So we'll definitely do some more episodes talking about this. Is there anything else you want to close out with, babe?
No.
You good?
Yes.
Okay. Never forget. Actually, what did you have?
There's a lot more that we'll talk about.
I know, right?
If you want to, I do. There's a lot of things. Never forget what we're
Start keeping a list, because it's something that we'll keep talking about.
I either go crazy with the lists and I overlist, and then it's a thing and I have to have it indented right and bulletined and number and like where I'm going to, or I don't do the list. So what do you want?
Let's find a happy medium.
Would that be easy?
How about you just jot stuff down?
Okay.
Just little reminders.
And where? Which form? Because then I have to organize that or not do it.
We'll figure this out, folks.
Emily.
Friday night on Instagram, we do Instagram Live. Come join us. It's fun. We've only done one. It was still fun. Well, by the time this comes out, we will have done more. What is it for?
I mean, it'll be Monday. It's Monday.
Wink, wink. And enjoy your week.
Enjoy your week.
I don't know. When in doubt.
Spread the cookie out.